It felt like I'd been driving forever, definitely more than 2 hours. I was headed to the Marriott in Baltimore. Rachel was there for a conference, and I thought it might be nice to surprise her with dinner. But, truth be told, I had another, much bigger reason for the trip. For the past 3 months, something had been eating at me, making me think that every time she left for one of these work trips, or any of her training sessions, she was seeing someone else. She always came back later than she said she would. Tonight, I was determined to get to the bottom of it. I needed to prove to myself that my suspicions were either true or just a product of my overactive imagination. After 14 years of marriage and raising two amazing kids, Sophia, who's 12, and Ethan, who's 10, I couldn't let these doubts fester any longer. The kids were staying the night with my mom, giving me the perfect chance to confront Rachel about what I'd been feeling. We'd gotten married right after high school, having been together for a couple of years before that. Rachel used to have this energy about her, always so positive, so vibrant. With her long brown hair and a figure that turned heads, it was hard not to notice her. But something changed a few months ago. Little things began to bug me, to unsettle me. I didn't want to come off as paranoid or jealous, so I kept those feelings bottled up. This conference, being so close by, gave me a perfect excuse to drop in unannounced. When I got to the hotel, I handed my suit bag to the front desk and introduced myself as David Miller. I told the clerk that my wife, Rachel, was at the insurance conference in room 214, and that she'd said I could pick up a key after confirming my identity. The clerk handed me the key, and I took a deep breath, feeling my nerves start to take over. What if I really caught her in the act? What would I even do? Should I knock, or should I just walk right in? Would she be alone? Walking down the hall, I decided I would use the key and see for myself. Trying to stay as quiet as possible, I slid the key card into the door and carefully opened it. What I saw threw me for a loop. Rachel was sitting at the desk, her briefcase open, going over some paperwork. When she turned around and saw me, her face was a mix of surprise and confusion. I quickly explained that I had some free time and figured I'd drop by to take her to dinner. To my surprise, Rachel was actually thrilled to see me. She suggested I stay the night and seemed excited about having me around. She came over and gave me a kiss. In that moment, I thought my plan to confront her had completely fallen apart. But then, as I made a light joke about wanting to spend some time together before dinner, she gave me a sly smile and suggested we share a quick moment before she jumped into the shower. She even promised we'd have a full night together afterward. For a brief second, I felt a weight lift off my chest. Maybe I had just been overthinking everything. We shared a quick but intense moment, and then she headed into the bathroom to shower. I took a deep breath, trying to push the earlier doubts from my mind, and sat down on the bed. As I sat there, my eyes landed on Rachel's toiletry bag on the dresser. I thought about checking it for some aspirin for the headache I'd gotten from the long drive. But instead of pain relief, I found something that made my heart drop: 6 condoms. I stared at the pack, my mind racing. After Ethan was born, Rachel switched to birth control pills, but they made her feel sick, so I had a vasectomy. We hadn't needed any kind of contraception since then. So, why were there condoms in her bag? It hit me all at once. She was cheating on me. There was no other explanation. But now what? I couldn't just ignore this. My thoughts started spinning out of control. In a moment of frustration, I did something I'm not proud of. I went through her bag and found a safety pin, the kind she always kept on hand for wardrobe malfunctions. With a twisted sense of resolve, I poked small holes in the center of each condom and carefully put them back where I'd found them. While Rachel was still in the shower, I pulled out my phone and called my friend Aaron. He's the kind of guy who'd drop everything for a friend, no questions asked. I needed a favor. Nothing major, just a phone call. I told him I needed him to call me in about an hour, pretending there was an emergency at home, like a burst pipe at the school that needed my immediate attention. Without hesitation, he agreed to call me around 7. At that moment, I knew I didn't want to stay the night with Rachel anymore, not after what I just found. The thought of being with her made my skin crawl. I figured I could use Aaron's call as the perfect excuse to leave and process everything. On the drive back home, when Rachel finally emerged from the bathroom, I could barely bring myself to meet her eyes. Every part of me screamed to confront her right then, to demand answers. But I held back. I knew losing my temper wouldn't help anything. I needed to keep my cool and figure out my next step. We made our way down to the dining room, and I did my best to act normal, even though inside, I was falling apart. Rachel seemed completely oblivious to the storm swirling inside me. As we sat at the table, I encouraged her to order whatever she wanted. She shrugged, saying she wasn't really hungry, and ordered a small filet mignon, suggesting we share a bottle of rose. After placing our order, I couldn't resist pushing a little bit. I casually asked her if she was happy in our marriage. She answered without skipping a beat, saying she was. She went on about how we had a great home, 2 amazing kids, and a husband who loved her. She said she couldn't ask for anything more. I nodded along, but her words hit me like a punch to the gut. How could she say that? How could she lie so easily while sneaking around behind my back? I couldn't help but admit that sometimes I wondered if I was doing enough to make her happy. Still, I made a point of saying how lucky I felt to have her as my wife. I even joked that sometimes I had to pinch myself to believe our life together was real. Rachel laughed and called me a silly goose, assuring me that I had driven all this way just to see her. She told me not to worry, that everything was fine, and that she was happy and content. When our meals arrived, we made small talk, but my mind was elsewhere. The discovery of those condoms was weighing on me, and as we finished eating, I could barely focus on what she was saying. My phone buzzed. It was Aaron, right on cue. I excused myself, stepping into the lobby to take the call. I made sure to linger for a few extra moments before returning to the table. When I came back, I told Rachel that my colleague had called about a burst pipe at the school and that I needed to leave immediately. Her face changed in an instant. She looked deflated, though I couldn't tell if she was genuinely upset or just annoyed that our evening was being cut short. Either way, it didn't seem to bother her as much as I thought it would. Regardless, I knew that consequences were coming her way. As we walked toward the elevator, a man I didn't recognize stepped out, greeting Rachel like an old friend. He introduced himself as Samuel Stevens and mentioned that he had stopped by her room earlier but hadn't gotten a response. He extended his hand to me and said, "Rachel talks about you all the time." "I'm Samuel." I forced a smile and shook his hand, but it took every ounce of effort to fake being polite. The tension in my stomach only grew as we stood there together. This was him, wasn't it? The man she was seeing behind my back. Once we reached our room, I turned to Rachel and told her firmly that I wanted her to quit her job. I couldn't stand the thought of her working so closely with Samuel. We discussed this before, but now it felt non-negotiable. She immediately pushed back, saying she wouldn't quit, and that I needed to get over my paranoia about her and Samuel. It felt like she was turning things around, making me the one with the problem. After a cold kiss, I grabbed my bags and left the hotel, my mind racing with anger and betrayal all the way home. I couldn't stop thinking about Samuel standing outside Rachel's room. By the time I got back to the house, I was a bundle of nerves. I hated her for what she was doing, and I despised myself for feeling so powerless to stop it. Divorce was consuming my thoughts, but without solid proof, I felt completely defeated. I knew Rachel was cheating, but I couldn't do anything about it yet. 2 days later, when Rachel returned from the conference, she acted like everything was just fine. Her cheerful demeanor was infuriating, only making my anger grow as she unpacked. I couldn't resist the temptation to check her bag again. To my dismay, there was still one condom left with the tiny hole I had poked in it. How many had she used in just a few days? The thought made my stomach churn. That Saturday, Rachel's company, Liberty Insurance, organized a picnic for employees and their families. The kids were excited, but I dreaded it. I had a feeling that some of her co-workers knew about the affair, and the thought of being the subject of gossip or crude jokes made my skin crawl. I might have been paranoid, but given everything that had happened, I couldn't help it. Rachel was in her element, laughing and mingling with her co-workers, including Samuel. They weren't overtly affectionate, but their interactions had a familiarity, an intimacy, that I couldn't ignore. It was as if nothing else mattered when they spoke. I tried to keep a low profile, not wanting to draw attention to myself. That's when a woman I hadn't met before approached me. "Hi, I'm Olivia Stevens," she introduced herself, revealing she was Samuel's wife. She was stunning, long auburn hair, piercing blue eyes, like someone straight out of a high-fashion magazine. For a moment, I was completely thrown off. How could Samuel betray someone like her? I had always loved Rachel, but Olivia was on a whole other level of beautiful. We exchanged pleasantries and, after a bit of small talk, decided to find a quieter spot to chat. We settled on a couple of benches by the lake, away from the picnic crowd, where we could talk privately. It was clear that Olivia had something weighing on her, and after a bit of hesitation, she finally spoke up. I didn't beat around the bush. I told her I had discovered the affair just that week. The relief on her face was instant. She admitted that she'd known about it for 2 months and had already made the decision to file for divorce. In fact, she had hired a private investigator to gather evidence. She explained that her lawyer had suggested asking Rachel to testify or at least provide a notarized statement to strengthen her case. When I asked about the evidence, she mentioned photographs and recorded phone conversations, though no videos yet. She was confident that the proof was more than enough to build a solid case. Then she asked me a question I wasn't expecting. Would I be willing to use some of the same evidence in my own divorce proceedings? Olivia also mentioned that she intended to sue Liberty Insurance for negligence, as she had statements from other employees who knew about the affair but didn't intervene. She was determined to make sure that both Samuel and Rachel faced consequences. She suggested we share any evidence we had, and I agreed. It made sense to join forces. She invited me to her house the next day, saying that Samuel would be golfing in the morning, so it would be a perfect time to go over everything she had. She lived at 26 Hemlock Avenue in Crest, Montana, just a short drive from where we were. We both laughed a little, knowing it wasn't exactly a date, but it was comforting to have someone else in the same boat. When we returned to the picnic area, it didn't seem like anyone had noticed we were gone. I felt a small flicker of hope, thinking maybe, just maybe, there was a way out of all this. The next morning, as expected, Rachel told me she was going shopping and would be gone for a few hours as soon as she left the house. I wasted no time dropping the kids off at my mom's place before heading over to Olivia's. When I arrived, she greeted me at the door with calm composure and led me into her den. The room had a cozy, welcoming vibe, furnished with a plush leather couch and a computer monitor sitting on a table in front of it, currently displaying an empty motel room. Olivia gestured for me to sit and offered me a drink. I opted for a soda, Pepsi, specifically, and asked her what we were about to watch. With a hint of excitement in her voice, she told me we were about to see Samuel play a round of golf, live and in full color. Naturally, my curiosity was piqued, and I asked how she had arranged this. She hinted at a familiar face, the caddy, and casually mentioned that it had cost her around $1,400. She added that she had a feeling Samuel would end up paying for it, one way or another. The session was set to last a couple of hours, so she encouraged me to get comfortable. She even had popcorn and nachos ready, promising to send me home with a DVD of the whole thing. Olivia admitted that while she wasn't thrilled about what we were about to see, she couldn't resist sticking around for the next 20 minutes. We chatted lightly as she began to share the details of the affair, showing me photos, audio recordings, and documents that illustrated the depth of Rachel and Samuel's relationship. The more she revealed, the clearer it became just how deep their involvement was. It was devastating, but at the same time, it was the proof I needed. Then, just as Olivia had predicted, the monitor flickered to life. There they were, Samuel and Rachel stepping into the motel room together. They wasted no time, undressing quickly and diving right into their connection without even exchanging a word of greeting. The video was strikingly clear, although the audio was a bit distorted. Watching my wife with another man felt surreal, like an invasion of my private world. It was one of the hardest things I'd ever had to witness. To lighten the mood, Olivia made a comment about how you rarely see a body like Rachel's. I managed a weak smile, but inside, I was completely numb. It felt too strange, and I didn't want to keep watching. After a few more agonizing minutes, I couldn't take it anymore. I turned to Olivia and told her I didn't need to see the rest of the footage. She wasn't exactly eager to continue either. Olivia sighed in agreement, admitting that it was painful for her, too. We both decided to stop the video, knowing the lawyers already had more than enough evidence. I confided in her, telling her how difficult it was to see Rachel in such a compromising position especially knowing she was just a room away. Everything about it felt wrong. Olivia nodded sympathetically and suggested we do something else. I felt a wave of relief when she mentioned showing me her koi ponds in the backyard. That sounded a lot more enjoyable than enduring another minute of the video. Her eyes lit up with excitement, and she seemed genuinely happy to share her passion with me. As we walked outside, I couldn't help but think about how this afternoon was turning out to be much more enjoyable for me than it ever would be for Rachel. The koi ponds were stunning. Olivia had 3 of them, each one more impressive than the last. She explained the intricate pumping and filtration systems, and I found myself fascinated, especially with my plumbing background. I offered to help her out whenever she needed it. It wasn't just about spending time with her, but I wasn't looking for anything romantic. Not yet, anyway. We spent hours outside, talking about everything except our unfaithful spouses. It was a much-needed distraction. When we finally went back inside, the monitor showed an empty motel room, signaling that Samuel and Rachel had left. It was time for me to head home. Olivia walked me to the door and promised to call when Samuel scheduled his next golf game. She suggested I bring Sophia and Ethan over to see the koi ponds sometime. It was a small comfort, something positive to hold on to amidst all the chaos. On the drive home, I felt a mix of emotions, relief, anger, and a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, I could find a way through this mess after all. The coming weeks were tough. Every time I took a shower, I found myself checking Rachel's bag, and each time, there was another stash of condoms. I couldn't wrap my head around how she was managing to use them all. It felt like she was living a double life that I had no access to. I kept the safety pin on my keychain, ready to poke holes in any new batch I found. On days when Samuel had his golf outings, I took the kids to visit Olivia. They adored spending time with her, calling her the koi lady in their little voices. They'd make colorful drawings of the fish and proudly show them to Rachel when we got home. It was almost comical how clueless she was, never once connecting the dots that Olivia was Samuel's wife. Rachel seemed relieved that I could entertain the kids while she focused on her own distractions. I tried talking to her again about quitting her job and ending things with Samuel, but each conversation ended with the same icy rejection. The second conversation was especially brutal. She tore into my masculinity, insinuating that I was the real problem. Those harsh exchanges made it easier for me to justify everything I was doing. I started making excuses to avoid intimacy with her. The less we interacted, the more I withdrew. Then one evening, Rachel dropped a bombshell. She said she was feeling overwhelmed and thought it would be a good idea to take some time off to visit her sister, Chloe. She planned to be gone for a few days, maybe even a week. In a fake show of concern, she pointed out how hard I had been working with all the overtime and late nights. She framed it as an opportunity for me to relax, making it sound like her trip was a generous gesture. That night, I barely slept, my mind racing with everything I needed to plan. The time to act had finally come. The next day, after Rachel left for her so-called time away, I sprung into action. I had to come clean to my parents, admitting that I had failed as a husband. They were incredibly supportive, offering their help without hesitation. The kids were excited to stay with their grandparents, and my dad's truck would be perfect for moving Rachel's things out of the house on Thursday morning. I didn't waste any time after dropping the kids off at my mom's. I headed straight for the clinic where I thought Rachel might have gone. After a grueling 3-hour drive, I hit a dead end, but there was still one last place to check, the Family Planning Center. I walked into the building, trying to look confident, and told the receptionist I was David Miller, here to sign some consent forms for my wife, Rachel. I played it off like I wasn't sure which form I was supposed to sign, but I mentioned it was about understanding the procedure and agreeing not to pursue any legal action. The receptionist nodded, checked her computer, and confirmed Rachel's details. She said Rachel's sister had already signed, but my signature would carry more weight. Without hesitation, I scribbled my name under Chloe's. The procedure was set for Friday at 11 a.m., with instructions to arrive an hour earlier. When I asked about any outstanding balance, the receptionist said Rachel had already paid the full $800 in cash. I thanked her, left the clinic, and felt a strange mix of anxiety and relief. It was all coming together. By the time I got to Chloe and Brian's place, the tension in the house was impossible to ignore. Rachel looked shocked to see me and asked what I was doing there. I told her my parents had taken the kids for a few days, so I'd taken some sick leave and figured I'd come over to visit. I casually mentioned that I needed to relax, just like she had. The moment I said it, I could feel the weight of the situation. The room went silent. I could almost hear the gears turning in their heads. I had definitely caught them off guard, and now they had to figure out how to respond. Chloe and Brian exchanged a look before he slipped into the kitchen with her. Rachel tried to keep the conversation light, but her unease was obvious. Brian came back a few minutes later and suggested we take his buddy Tom's boat out on the lake the next day for some fresh air. I acted enthusiastic, pretending a day on the lake sounded perfect, even though I had no intention of actually going. The next morning, Tom was waiting with the boat, but I made it clear to Brian that I wasn't going anywhere. As he started prepping lunch and stocking the cooler, I stood by the truck, watching him. He asked if I was getting in. I told him straight up that I had changed my mind. I wasn't wasting my day with him and Tom. I told him he should enjoy it while it lasted because when he came back, he'd have to deal with Chloe, and I doubted she'd be in a good mood. Brian tried to talk me into going, throwing out a few half-hearted threats, but after several minutes of back and forth, he realized I wasn't backing down. So, he and Tom left without me. Once they were out of sight, I walked back inside, grabbed a cup of coffee, and turned off my phone. I called my dad. He's an early riser, and we talked for a couple of hours. Meanwhile, I ignored the calls coming through, knowing it was probably Samuel trying to reach Rachel. I figured Brian must have warned Chloe, but I wasn't about to make it easy for them. Eventually, Rachel and Chloe woke up, and I ended my call with my dad. I braced myself for the inevitable confrontation when Chloe's phone buzzed back to life. They had about 5 minutes before they were supposed to leave for the family planning center. I finished off the coffee pot and brewed a fresh one for them, knowing what was coming. Rachel shot me an irritated look and asked what I was still doing there. I told her that I wasn't interested in fishing and figured I'd stick around with them for the day. I suggested we find a nice place for lunch, since I had to leave that night. Rachel shot my suggestion down without a second thought, her voice sharp. She insisted that she and Chloe had plans, and she didn't want me tagging along. "We only see each other a couple of times a year," she said, as if that somehow made it okay for her to ignore me. She reminded me that I had the whole week to spend with her. I wasn't backing down. I shot back, telling her that since I had driven all the way here, the least she could do was spare me a few hours. Chloe, clearly annoyed, stepped outside to make a phone call. Rachel sat there, looking like she'd just been blindsided. From the other room, I could hear Chloe raising her voice, chewing Brian out for leaving me behind. Rachel tried one last time to get me to leave, saying their plans didn't involve me and I'd just be an intrusion. I stood my ground, calmly telling her I wanted to know what their plans were so I could decide if I wanted to stick around or find something else to do. I even joked, asking if they were meeting some guys, which she quickly denied. Rachel explained their plans involved shopping for personal items like bras, underwear, and nightgowns. Definitely things they didn't want a man around for. I shrugged and pointed out that most of those stores were at the mall, so I could easily entertain myself while they shopped. I even offered to take them out for a nice lunch afterward to make up for any inconvenience I caused. Chloe came back in, glaring at me without saying a word. I had a feeling her earlier phone call was to the family planning center, probably to reschedule Rachel's appointment. They probably figured they could just wait me out and head there once I was gone. But I wasn't letting them off that easy. I insisted on driving my own car, making it clear I wasn't going to be ditched at the service station while they got away from me. I took my sweet time at the station, filling the tank, checking the oil, wiping the windshield. It felt like the longest routine maintenance I'd ever done. I could see them fuming in the passenger seats, but I didn't care. When we finally got to the mall, I parked as far from the entrance as I could, making sure we had a long walk ahead of us. I let them wander off while I stayed close but out of their way. It was obvious they weren't enjoying themselves. Most of the time, they were whispering to each other and throwing frustrated glances in my direction. They picked up a few things here and there, but it was obvious that the whole trip felt forced, like they were just going through the motions. I kept a close eye on them, though I didn't care about their purchases. The important thing was that I had delayed the inevitable. The time for their appointment had come and gone, and I knew Rachel would have to reschedule. While I didn't plan on stopping her from going through with it, I couldn't help but feel a small sense of satisfaction in making things a little harder for her. Around noon, we met up in the mall's center court, just as planned. We decided to grab lunch at Olive Garden, then headed back to the house. The car ride was thick with tension, the silence heavy. I could tell both women were furious with me, but for the first time in weeks, I felt a strange sense of empowerment. I felt like I had the upper hand. When we got back to the house, I grabbed a beer and sank into the couch, a quiet satisfaction settling in. A couple of hours later, Brian came back, but not without facing an intense verbal barrage from Chloe. It went on for a solid half hour. Afterward, he disappeared again, only reappearing when it was time for dinner. Later that evening, after the dishes were cleared, I approached Rachel and asked if we could talk privately in the kitchen. Chloe shot me a look full of disdain but didn't say anything. She and Rachel moved into the living room, leaving us alone. Rachel was still visibly upset from everything that had happened, and I knew this conversation wouldn't be easy, but I was ready for it. I didn't waste any time. I confronted her again, repeating my demand that she quit her job and sever all ties with Samuel Stevens. Rachel's jaw tightened, her eyes flashing with anger, as if she was holding back a storm. She snapped that she didn't want to hear it again, that I needed to stop bringing it up. She was fed up with me pushing, telling me I already knew her answer wouldn't change. She gave me an ultimatum: either change the subject or leave. But I wasn't backing down. Instead, I reached into the manila envelope I had brought and pulled out a legal-sized envelope. Inside were the divorce papers. I told her that I had asked her at least 10 times in the past 2 months to quit her job and end things with Samuel, and every time she had flatly refused. I told her to sign the papers and mail them in. I even handed her a self-addressed, stamped envelope for her convenience. I told her she could have a lawyer review them if she wanted, but I was done waiting for her to make a decision. Rachel's face twisted with fury. She leaned across the table, her voice low but seething as she hissed, "You can't divorce me just because I won't quit my job or stop being friends with someone you don't like." She insisted I had no grounds for divorce and reminded me that she was still my wife and wasn't going to give up her home or her family just because I didn't like her work situation. I paused for a moment, carefully choosing my words, knowing the storm was coming. Then, I pulled out a set of photos from the envelope. I laid them out on the table, 6 images, each one showing Rachel and Samuel in compromising situations. I asked her flatly, "Is that enough grounds for divorce?" For a brief moment, Rachel's complexion drained of color. She looked like she might faint, but instead of showing any guilt or regret, she exploded into a tirade. She accused me of spying on her and started hurling insults, calling me sneaky and underhanded. Worse still, she called me a pervert, accusing me of getting some sick satisfaction from discovering her infidelity. She said my actions made her feel sick. Just then, my phone rang. It was my dad calling to let me know he'd be arriving in about 10 minutes with her things. I hung up the phone and turned back to Rachel, who was still seething with rage. She demanded to know who had called, and I told her calmly that my dad was bringing her things to Chloe's place. I explained that I had already changed the locks on her house, and if she'd forgotten anything, I would retrieve it for her. I handed her the title to her car, which I had already signed over to her. Then, I gave her an envelope containing half of our joint bank account, about $200. I explained that she would have visitation rights with the kids once a week, with the possibility of an overnight stay once a month, but only if she signed a statement admitting to the affair and had it notarized. I casually mentioned that I also had a DVD of her and Samuel's little rendezvous at the Scandium Motel on May 10th. The footage, which lasted 2 hours, covered everything shown in the photos. I collected the pictures from the table and told her I hadn't taken them myself. I wasn't interested in her affairs, I just couldn't stand the deception. Finally, I pulled out the last item from my envelope, the safety pin I had been carrying around. I slid it across the table toward her and explained that I had used it to poke holes in all the condoms she had been using for the past 2 months. I told her I had noticed she'd gone through 48 condoms in just 2 weeks, something I had never imagined she would do. Rachel's face flushed crimson as she absorbed the gravity of my words. She called me a miserable weasel, saying what I had done was the most despicable act she'd ever encountered. But I stayed calm, unshaken. I told her the real despicable act was her infidelity. I might have been a fool, but she was the one who had broken our marriage vows. I stood up to leave as my dad was pulling into the driveway. I noted that not once had she offered an apology or showed any remorse for her actions. I bid her farewell, wishing her well with her upcoming procedure, not forgetting to mention that it was on Monday. That's when the tears finally started to flow. As I walked out of the room, I heard Rachel break down in sobs. Chloe rushed to comfort her, and Brian followed me onto the porch. He looked at me, clearly trying to process everything that had just happened. "You can't just throw away a 14-year marriage over this," he said, almost as if he were pleading with me. I challenged him. "Why did Rachel come to see you, and Chloe, if it was just a misunderstanding?" Brian stared down at his shoes, his face a mask of guilt. After a long silence, he mumbled an apology and offered to help unload the truck. We finished unloading in about 10 minutes while Rachel continued crying inside. I didn't care why she was crying. It was too little, too late. The following week, both Rachel and Samuel were fired from Liberty Insurance. Rachel refused to sign the affidavit that Olivia's lawyer had requested. My lawyer assured me that our case was solid enough even without the affidavit. After that night, I didn't hear a word from Rachel. Not one. She didn't even visit the kids, which, oddly enough, didn't seem to affect them. They were bonding with Olivia, and we were spending more and more time together as a family. There was no talk of romance between us, at least not yet. We were both focused on navigating our divorces and doing what was best for our kids. Over the following months, I learned more about Coy than I ever thought I would, and I relished every moment of it. By the time 4 months had passed, both divorces were finalized. Rachel didn't put up any resistance, but Samuel, well, he went down fighting, losing everything. The house, the investments, and shortly before Christmas, he found himself saddled with hefty alimony payments to Olivia. Rachel showed up at our place around the holidays, bearing gifts for the kids, trying to keep some semblance of the holiday spirit alive. I chose to be polite, keeping my true feelings in check. She played the role of the devoted mother for a couple of hours before quietly slipping away, just as she had arrived. We didn't discuss the divorce or her affair. It was almost as if those painful events had never happened. Yet, after she left, I felt an unexpected sense of closure. The house was on the market, and a couple of months later, I moved in with Olivia. Meanwhile, Samuel had managed to secure a job in Omaha and took Rachel with him. For months later, he disappeared without a trace, leaving Rachel in the dark about his whereabouts. Not long after that, she moved back in with Chloe, who was also dealing with her own divorce after Brian had accepted a position working on the Alaskan pipeline. Brian had sent Chloe the divorce papers through the mail, leaving the two sisters to lean on each other. Both of them were reeling, abandoned by the men they'd once trusted. As for me, life with Olivia was flourishing. Our relationship was comfortable, and she truly adored my kids, who returned that affection in full. We cherished every moment, and by June, wedding plans were underway. Both of us had moved past the trauma of our previous marriages and were eager for a fresh start. Finally, life had settled into a calm, joyful rhythm. As for the man Rachel had left me for, well, his luck didn't hold out. A few weeks after his disappearance, I heard the news. He had been mugged outside his favorite bar. The attackers had beaten him severely, leaving him with 5 broken ribs, shattered kneecaps, and a number of missing teeth. He'd lost not only his wallet, but also one of his testicles in the brutal attack. It felt like karma had caught up with him, putting an end to his carefree, dishonest life. Olivia and I continued to grow closer, not just as romantic partners, but as a true family. The kids and I were immersed in learning about koi, spending countless afternoons in the backyard, watching the fish glide through the water while we enjoyed the peace we had worked so hard to create. After everything we'd been through, it finally felt like we were building the life we had always deserved. The chaos and betrayal were behind us, replaced by the simple joy of being together. Then one day, Olivia surprised me with some amazing news. She had purchased a beautiful 6-bedroom villa nearby, funded by the savings she'd accumulated before selling her business. The villa was everything we could have wanted, complete with a large swimming pool where we could soak up the sun on scorching summer days. To my delight, Olivia had also preserved my old Chevrolet Corvette, hiding it away in the garage as a charming reminder of happier times. It had been waiting patiently for us to take it for a scenic drive along the coast, and that day was coming. We planned to visit one of our favorite French restaurants, where the three of us, Olivia, me, and the Corvette, would enjoy a peaceful meal together to celebrate the journey we had made so far. As for Rachel, the last I heard, she was still living with Chloe, trying to piece her life back together after Samuel's betrayal. But that was no longer my concern. I had finally moved on, ready to start a new chapter with Olivia by my side. We were both excited about what the future held.